to this event. It's my privilege this morning to welcome you to today's conference entitled Democracy versus January 6th, Causes and Consequences of Divisive Politics and Civic Unrest. Today's conference initially grew out of a wide range of conversations among scholars in the American Political Science Association Civic Engagement section about what produced last year's attack on the Capitol, which was the first occupation of the Capitol since the War of 1812. What that event may tell us about the state of American democratic politics today, and how we might best understand the events of January 6th here in Washington within the broader context of the nation's political and social history. Today's discussions, which will feature both first-person accounts of the events of that day, as well as panel discussions featuring scholars from several disciplines, essentially represents a continuation of, really an expansion of that conversation coming out of the APSA, as well as an opportunity for us to look back on the events of January 6th with some perspective, at least some perspective, and some more information that we had at that time about what occurred that day, ultimately, and what it may mean for the future. Needless to say, none of us can know at this point what all of these events will come to be in future generations. Indeed, we're learning with obviously a committee on Capitol Hill looking at these issues. We're learning more every day about what actually happened and what it may mean ultimately. And we're also in the middle of an important debate that I think we'll talk about a little bit today of trying to figure out how to frame it even and label it and talk about it. Was it an insurrection? Was it an attack on the Capitol? Was it something less? Was it an attack on democracy? So that we as a society are dealing with those questions right now. Can't solve those questions or answer those questions today, but we have enough perspective at this point anyway to at least get a first cut at some of these things and talk about them as a community, essentially. So that's the goal for today, ultimately. Before we start, and as soon as I'm done talking, actually, let me just take a minute to quickly thank, on behalf of the planning committee, first of all, the terrific staff here at James Madison University Washington Center, Kara, students from James Madison who are here doing the live streaming and doing the tech stuff that I don't know how to do personally. So I really appreciate that. And thanks for giving us a venue where we can come together and talk about these things. We'd also like to thank our speakers who are generously giving their time on Saturday. And some have traveled quite long distances to get here too, to share their experiences in terms of first-person accounts and also their work on this issue. And thanks to the students who are here, not only here, but also watching on pointing as if I'm pointing. It's on YouTube, so lots of people are joining there. And on a personal note, let me also thank fellow members of my planning committee, the planning committee. And special thanks to Amanda Lehman, who's our administrative assistant at the Menard Family Center, who's watching from Ohio and has done a lot of work to logistically just to get our group here, first of all, and also to make this event happen for us too. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start with the first panel. And welcome and thanks for coming.
Wonderful. So good morning. I'm Dr. Kedrowski. I'm Associate Director at the James Madison Center for Civic Engagement at James Madison University. I'm just delighted to have you all here with us this morning. Thank you, John, for welcoming us. Our panel this morning is comprised of contributors to a special themed issue of the E-Journal of Public Affairs that has been located at Missouri State University. And our panelists will be sharing with us today some of their research in that journal. And so we're actually going to set this up as a conversation, hopefully, and we've got some questions specific to each of their contributions to the journal, but hopefully we all will chime in, and we'll also have time for your questions as well, or comments and observations. So first, I'm hoping we have Ken Moffitt. He is Chair of Political Science at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. And has come in all the way from Illinois this weekend. So thank you so much for being with us. Ken, I wonder if you can set the stage for us this morning by sharing what we know about the legal and other ways in which President Donald Trump tried to unsuccessfully overturn the results of the 2020 election.
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. And first off, thank you to Dr. Whaley for her work in putting everything together, and thank you to my fellow panelists. And also thank you to the audience members both in person and virtually, for being here to talk through all this. And so I want to set the stage here for January 6th and the varying election-related challenges that Donald Trump put forth by going back to his campaign. And during 2020, the campaign knew that the polling results weren't looking as good for them as what they did in 2016. And so there's some reasons for this, including the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, the handling of the protests in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, the state of the economy, as well as the polarizing nature of the Trump presidency itself. And this turned off some key demographics, including suburbanites, white women, college-educated voters, and many independents. And his closing arguments, so to speak, were a list of grievances, if you will, including, against among others, Dr. Fauci, the media, COVID-19 case counts, i.e. were the case counts really the case counts, and then also the fraud of mail-in voting and the potential for Democrats stealing the election. And in fact, I'll quote Donald Trump from his Twitter account on May 26th. Quote, "It will be the greatest rigged election in history." So he was setting up for this 5.5 months before the election even took place. So we go forward to election night, because that really sets the stage for the varying ways in which Trump and others tried to challenge the results of the 2020 election. So on election night, things weren't looking so good for Donald Trump. And Trump needed to address his supporters and tell them something. And so as the results came in, Rudy Giuliani suggested that Trump address his supporters and just simply tell them that he won in Michigan and Pennsylvania. Mind you, results were still coming in. And so Giuliani's advice to Trump was just say that he won. So on 11:20 p.m. on election night, Fox News calls Arizona. And Trump and his team, they hit the roof on this. And there's a couple of books that have come out, including the one that I reviewed for the E-Journal of Public Affairs, that talks about some of the ways in which this happened. Giuliani reiterated his advice, just go declare victory right now. And so later on, Trump addresses his supporters and stated that he had won and claimed that he won in Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. And so Donald Trump that night, to quote him, he said, "This was a very good moment. This is a major fraud in our nation. We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the US Supreme Court. As far as I'm concerned, we've already won it." And so Trump began this asserting simply that he won, have actual evidence notwithstanding here, and calling the 2020 election, quote, "the big lie." And he got millions of Americans to believe, and who still do. And Trump also got people to act on this incorrect belief. So right after the election, Trump continues on his Twitter account claiming that he won for electoral vote purposes the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in which in his words, will, quote, which won't allow legal observers, the state of Georgia and the state of North Carolina, each one of which he claimed had a big Trump lead. Of course, he only won in North Carolina, as far as those states listed, he didn't win the others. And so all to say, this set the stage for Trump filing legal challenges to the election procedures in varying states, including Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Arizona. You also had automatic recounts that happened in Wisconsin and also happened in Georgia. And Biden won both times, just as he had originally. You also had a recount much later in Arizona, where the results came in, and Biden actually won by more than his original vote count indicated from that recount. And so we look at the lawsuits alone. As of January 6, 2021, Trump filed 62 lawsuits in state and federal courts related to the 2020 election. He lost 61. So for those doing the back of the envelope math, that's a 98.39% losing percentage. And a lot of the lawsuits were dismissed, or he otherwise lost due to lack of standing, while others were dismissed on the merits. Another thing that's important and worth noting, it was Democratic and Republican judges alike making similar rulings. So it's not as if, for example, it were just Democratic judges who had it in for Trump. In fact, several of the judges who made these rulings were Trump appointees. And also Trump got rejected 3 times by the Supreme Court. Once on December 8th, again on December 11th, and a 3rd time on March 8th, 2021. You keep in mind the Supreme Court has 6 Republican appointed justices. In addition, we fast forward to some events in Georgia, where Trump called Brad Raffensperger. So when the legal challenges were failing, called the Secretary of State in Georgia, a fellow Republican, on January 2nd. And if you listen to the 1-hour phone call, Trump badgered him repeatedly. But I'm going to go ahead and pull a couple of quotes here. What Trump said to Brad Raffensperger. I just want you to find 11,780 votes, which is 1 more than we have. So again, we talk about another strategy that Trump employed. Simply trying to persuade elected officials simply to dig up more votes for him when the legal challenges were failing. Another quote from Trump during the same phone call. You know what they did, and you're not reporting it. You know that's a criminal offense. And you know you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk. For the record, there's an ongoing investigation in Georgia to determine whether Trump committed a crime that day that violated Georgia state law. The grand jury begins its work on May 2nd this year. In addition, some political scientists much later evaluated Trump's electoral fraud claims in an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And the 3 political scientists were Eggers, Garrow, and Brenner. They found no evidence to support any of those claims. And if you look at the abstract, they said, reviewing the most prominent of these statistical claims, we conclude that none of them is even remotely convincing. And we keep in mind the 3 people who wrote the article, 2 of them are very prominent top-tier political methodologists and statisticians by any measure. And so when the electoral fraud claims failed to gain traction legally, and the persuading electoral officials failed to gain traction, the door number 3, so to speak, was trying to get Mike Pence to overturn the election. And this idea hatched from one of his members of his legal team, John Eastman. So Eastman came up with a plan in which Pence would delay the certification of the electoral votes on January 6th. In turn, this would buy Trump time to persuade state legislatures to simply appoint different slates of electors. And in so doing, give Trump a win. Pence refused to do so because Pence didn't believe that he had the constitutional or legal authority to do that. And so John Eastman on January 6th said, quote, all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into it so we can get to the bottom, referring to supposedly ballots being cut from voting machines to favor Biden, which by the way, there's no evidence for any of that. And so Pence again concluded that he didn't have authority to do this, and to do so would be to violate the Constitution. There was a related plan to simply get Pence just to not certify the election results. Pence refused, stating that to do so would be unconstitutional. And so Eastman ended up writing around that time a series of incriminating emails that the House January 6th committee has gotten a hold of. And the select January 6th committee has tipped its hand a little bit on this in a court filing with reference to Eastman that they recommend that the Attorney General indict both Eastman and Trump for their actions to get Pence to overturn the election. And Congress is also looking to amend the Electoral Count Act so that way it couldn't be taken advantage in some of these ways in the future. And then when all else fails, Trump and others on January 6th incited a riot in an insurrection. And at the rally on January 6th, before the events happened at the Capitol, Rudy Giuliani stated, so let's have a trial by combat. I'm willing to stake my reputation. The president is willing to stake his reputation on the fact that we're going to find criminality. For the record, no criminality has been found with respect to the 2020 election, other than say a few isolated individual level cases of of voting irregularities, none of which would have affected the outcome. And then Trump. And I'm intentionally quoting some of these people because it's best to hear from some of the people who did stuff on that day. So Trump said, we fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, and we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and get. So some of the crowd elsewhere in Washington, D.C. took Trump and others up on their invitation and stormed the Capitol building, committing varying crimes along the way. Here's some numbers in the aftermath to close my remarks. $1.5 million as of March 13th, $1.5 million in damage to the Capitol, 775 arrested, 224 pled guilty to federal charges, 110 have been sentenced, 350 people are still sought by the FBI, and 140 police officers were assaulted on.
Thank you so much for giving us that opening and description. I think what you really laid out for us is something that Kevin Kosar, Senior Fellow at American Enterprise Institute, picks up in his piece about the ways in which January 6th, we both leading up to and some of its consequences really imperiled a long-standing norm in American politics, a long-standing tradition of the peaceful transition of power. Kevin, I wonder if you can start by sharing with us how January 6th is really situated in the broader context of global democratic decline.
Sure, thanks. Well, it sits within that context easily enough. As way of background, I should note that from this line I'm very dying to Stanford numbers, 1974 to 2007, the world saw the greatest expansion in the number of countries that adopted democratic ways of doing things. It was a wonderful period of time if you look at presidential democracy. Cold War, and of course, huddle under my desk in fear of Soviet bombs being dropped on our school and that sort of stuff, and to have Eastern European countries breaking away, Soviet Union itself crumbling. Middle band, of course, the winds of change were here, and everything was blowing in a democratic direction. Well, 2008. Things started going the other way. We started seeing regimes that looked like they were on the right track, going on the wrong track, and it was happening all over the place. Venezuela, we saw the rise of Hugo Chavez, and then Maduro, a mixture of trade unionism, nationalism, all this stuff going in this. Look at Hungary, Viktor Orban, very much nationalistic, sort of strongman variant of democracy that once you start looking down the road, a strongman don't tend to want to give up power. Becomes trapped, it just gets worse and worse. See louder. They once had elections that meant something. So, this democratization movement has some obvious characteristics. Speech, press, and there was also this kind of commitment to the procedures that are so important to democracy, the electoral procedures. You want to vote, and not worry about being beat up. The vote can be counted. There's going to be some neutral, fair administration of the process of operating the elections, and then when the results come out, well, rejection of a lot of that. Process was the process. Process, you talk to anybody who knows that. Well, best process. Sorry. Like best process that is tested on every run. 8 years ago, Georgia didn't have paper ballots as a backup. They did in this election. So maybe around actually in this country, all the criticism of them is first the odds and first unfair. Very low run and getting better and better. This is not Chicago. Chicago in 1960. Where there was often halls controlling the ballot boxes and the election machines, the vendors for the election machines. This country's had a long path to running elections. Sure did. Yeah. Look at that, January 6th, the culmination of a long period to create disbelief in the fair election administration and to overturn the results. To use congressional authority and they're contrary to the federal system, to reject states' ways of electoral codes. And the second fact, legislation controlled by Republicans, and we hopefully go along with overturning the popular vote. It's distressing in that it looks very similar to sort of the executive strongman of triple democracy throughout the country.
I wonder if we can follow up as well. So your research piece in the e-journal of Public Affairs, which we're including a link in the live stream to your research article, along with Ellen.
Oh, yes, Elayne Allen.
Elayne Allen, yes, thank you. Along with Elayne Allen as your co-author. So Congress twice affirmed the norm that it should not overturn a state certified election. I wonder if you can also share with us in your research on this, how we might understand the role of norms in protecting our democracy and in protecting democratic practices and institutions, because in some of your description, a lot of what this came down to, we have this institutional struggle, particularly between the executive and Congress. And there's several arguments that really it was norms that saved the day and not our institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the more I thought about this, the more I found myself in trouble, because the norms and the institutions are so balled up in one another in our understanding of these things. Institutions don't run themselves. People do it based upon shared understanding of how things are supposed to work. And, what we saw on January 6th was a disruptive plan run that had been tried before. There's no protest vote by a Democrat, Democratic members. That happened. There were other protests on January 2 meetings of Congress. So this was there as a game plan developing. And then, GOP ran with it. And they took something that was kind of a symbolic exercise that would never actually change actual results. And we kind of very close to changing actual results. But that as that was, there was another contested election, actually a couple of them. One of which was in Iowa that I highlighted in my paper, another was in Illinois. And there was an opportunity where you had a Democratic majority in Congress who had clear partisan incentive to simply throw out the results. And these candidates, both in Iowa and in Illinois, competed in Congress. They were Democratic candidates. He said, Congress, you should look at this. There's some sort of irregularities, fraud, was that and the other. You should consider throwing out the results and maybe be the loser the next legislature. So by law, this could get reviewed by the Committee on House Administration, House Administration, or Democrats and Republicans. So looking from the outside, yeah, more Democrats and Republicans on the committee, and more Democrats and Republicans in the House. You might have thought your partisanship, these election results are going to get thrown out. They weren't. And I dig into the paper and showed that the reason they weren't thrown out is for a variety of reasons. One, Democrats were responding to January 6th and saying, you can't throw people's votes out. Congress can't do that. So the thing now, on one side, it's hard to then turn around and to do that with congressional elections. Second, the cases themselves were quite weak because processes used to review them at the state level, particularly in Iowa, were robust. And third, there were these kind of complex partisan individual level incentives that made Republicans certainly keep those backs up about this, but also discourage Democrats from pushing hard. And so this norm of deferring to state level results survived January 6th. It survived, these two state level challenges. And we don't talk about that latter case too much. More elevated by this court, because part of the way that norms endure is based upon more of us having shared how things are supposed to work. John Eastman probably was a disruptive effort. We didn't think much about how the electoral count acts. Mostly it was attorneys and scholars who have been waving their hands for years saying, this is a problem, it's ambiguous, bad things can happen. But the rest of us, the elites in Congress, didn't much think about it. So John Eastman tried to show up, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a possibility. Yes, it's complicated. It's complicated. Type laws can help. I definitely want to. But getting shared understanding of the union, firm, like Pence did. Donald Trump was sitting in that chair. People made a difference.
Can I ask one final follow-up? You've already started to touch on this, especially thinking about your recommendation that we will need to have a shared understanding of norms. We also need to revisit the electoral compact. What other lessons should we take away to ensure that governing traditions rooted in constitutional and democratic principles endure?
Yeah. Whew. That's a paper. Right? One of the ironies of the situation is that, my first inclination was like, my goodness, we have to strengthen civics education, get people more committed to the Constitution and statutory laws, etc. That was my first reaction. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but it occurred to me also that two of the leading protagonists, that's the correct word, in this January 6th drama were one Senator Ted Cruz and one Senator Joshua Hawley, both of whom are trained in constitutional law and elite law schools and should know better. So in civics we trust is perhaps not the right answer, but rather I think one of the ways that you forge shared understandings of how institutions are supposed to work is by there are all sorts of aspects of our election machinery that are autopilot. People don't. Getting politicians to engage in those things, which are not typically electoral, sound they would be elected for fixing feels like a big piece of the puzzle to me. I mean, there are all sorts of other stuff with depolarization and things like that. But as an institutionalist, the guy who works here in DC, getting people to pay attention to those things so that forge a shared understanding of what laws mean and how the processes are supposed to work. And then
Rosenthal, Randolph-Macon College, thank you so much for joining us. So on January 6th, one of the rioters told a reporter while they were storming the U.S. Capitol, "This is our country, this is our house." Your research for the Journal of Public Affairs really looks at the changes over time in the securitization of space at the Capitol and how that affects the public's perception and engagement with the democratic institutions. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the implications of the securitization of space and how that has contributed to the public's alienation of our government, with its implications both for January 6th, but also more broadly.
and wanted to situate that in concepts of democratic theory. I also want to say we take as a given that there are always going to be trade-offs between liberty and security. So this is not an argument to just say, you don't need to secure the Capitol. First of all, that would be absurd and dangerous. And second of all, in any context, any policy-making context, there are always those trade-offs. And sort of lastly, as background, I want to say that I have personal experience sort of in watching some of this securitization play out. I was an APSA congressional fellow in 1997-98. If you read the piece or you remember your history as it pertains to securitization of the Capitol, July 98 is when a man approached the Capitol with a gun and shot and killed 2 Capitol police officers right outside the House Minority Leader's office. I was at work that day, the Capitol went on lockdown. But I have some context of what things were like before that and after that. I also was back as a United States Supreme Court fellow in the 2006-2007 academic year. And so that was 5 years post September 11th. And both the Supreme Court and the US Capitol had implemented a number of post 9/11 security structures. And so this piece came out of my colleagues' interest in democratic theory and my own observation about, it's very different now to go to the Capitol than it was when I got there as a very doe-eyed congressional fellow in 1997. And so to more directly answer Kara's question, I think, in our piece, we're arguing that we have so set Congress apart, perhaps by necessity, but that's what we're trying to unpack. We've so set Congress apart from the public that it's dependent upon for its work, or is supposed to be dependent upon for its work, that the public no longer sees itself as really part of the process. Now, there are, of course, any number of explanations for that we could unpack even further, but from the perspective of physically entering the space or being in Washington, D.C. and thinking, I'd like to go see, my government in action. Even just someone who approaches the Capitol to walk to it is struck immediately by these barriers, by what appears to be a message that says, you are not welcome here. We also point out that to the extent that the Capitol now welcomes visitors, it very much resembles a tourist activity. So if you've tried to enter the Capitol recently, you know that unless you're entering with a member or through a member's office, you enter through the Capitol Visitor Center, which is this cavernous underground space. You queue to get the ticket that you've ideally reserved ahead of time. You are directed to experience the exhibits while you wait for your video to start. And then you queue for the video, and then you watch the video, and then you queue again for a very specific, very specific tour where you stay with your group, you wear a headset to hear your guide who probably has 30 or 35 people with them. It very much reminds me of tourist activities that I've participated in, as I've gone to museums and other places or visited other historic sites. And so a visitor to the Capitol now is no longer really welcomed as someone who's a participant in the democratic process, but really is welcomed as someone who's there to experience the historic nature of the building, to see the beautiful artwork that adorns the walls or the leading corridors. But the Capitol now has a much different feel. It no longer feels like a space where people come to be part of the democratic process. So, in terms of understanding that role of how securitization affects the public perception of democratic institutions, I would imagine, and this is less of an academic perspective and more of just sort of thinking that through, I would imagine that for many people who come to the Capitol, they don't experience any element of the democratic process whatsoever while they're there. And I think not exclusively or not entirely, but in large part, we can trace that to the way that we have now so shaped how people are allowed to experience the facility, that it really separates people from the government.
That's such an important insight and point. And I think also links well with what Kevin said earlier regarding challenges that we have to reaching a shared understanding when we have, and especially when we have elites who essentially can engage in the democratic process, but that it's not open to the broader public. So, I am a believer in civics education, but I wonder, what kind of civic education, what kind of civic engagement really could address the ways in which the public and governmental institutions interact. And it sounds to me, based on both Kevin's research and yours, that more work needs to be done on the side that actually holds power, like in our institutions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so, I mean, Kevin is a friend and co-author in another setting, and I take his point that education at elite institutions in constitutional law is not even necessarily sufficient for engendering support for democratic principles or ideals. But I can't help be struck by, and anyone who's worked on the Hill will also recognize this, spend a summer in DC and you will, if you're working there, be frustrated multiple times by the close-up kids, right? And those of you who work on the Hill know what I'm talking about, right? So you're walking down the street and there are 4,000 kids all wearing close-up badges, right? And they're there on a civics, basically an immersive civics experience. So you finally get around them, you go in the building, you press the button for the elevator, doors open, it's full of close-up kids, right? You cannot get away from them. And I have done my share of complaining, and in full disclosure, my husband was a close-up kid. Came from Cleveland in 6th grade to do that. But that kind of education, that kind of engagement, I think can be really meaningful. When students at a young age, not with Josh Hawley going off to study constitutional law, but at a young age, maybe keep them away from jaded staffers when they're out of the elevator, right? But you get the opportunity to come, to be in these spaces, to actually hear from members of Congress or even staff members talking to them about the work that they do, who have a chance to be present in those spaces where real information is given to them, not as to them as part of some giant, tourist group per se. And I think there are forms of civic education that we can think about that can foster that. That of course requires resources. And those of us who do this as a career know that civics education has been cut from a number of statewide curricula. There have been studies showing that the number of hours that elementary school age children spend engaged in civic education or social studies has declined over the last several decades. And so, and I think I can say this up here on this panel, right? The joke among political scientists who teach American government is the most common name for a high school government teacher is coach, right? And I mean, no harm, it is intended to be a joke, right? My high school government teacher was phenomenal and is why I to school for this, and he was a volleyball coach. But there's a sense of like, well, anybody can do this, right? You just watch the news, or you just read the newspaper and the New York Times will tell you everything. And so we have moved away from sort of substantive, rigorous civic education in our schools. And I think that means we are raising up generations of young people who don't understand how government functions. And then they come to DC and what they see is not government in action, but take a tour to a block of the Rudy corridors. And it's not necessarily inculcating the values of it. Work. Really important. And the National Education Association survey and research every year, has, as I said, has consistently shown a decline, not only in civics education, but also most importantly in the experiential side of learning. And so it's one thing to read the books or have knowledge, but we know that that's not deep learning. That banking knowledge does not work. And so if we don't have that experiential learning, if that is entirely missing from our civics education, what do we expect then to happen to our democracy in terms of Can I say one more thing? You had asked, and I don't think I answered, the implications of securitization and public alienation sort of more broadly. And one of the things that I sort of think about now is, and is that these are choices that we make, right? So when I was a Supreme Court fellow, we met with the former Marshal Ken Talkin, who talked about the approach that the Supreme Court took after September 11th. And they made a very conscious decision that they were going to really secure the building, but that they didn't want the public to feel alienated when they were there. This was a very conscious decision. And the way she described it is she said, we think we're the court of last resort. And she said, but what that really means is that people have to believe that they can come into this space and it may be the last time they're going to be heard. And I was really struck by that conscious decision that the court made. And she said, there's all kinds of security stuff that you all would never see, you don't know anything about. And we're confident that we can keep the justices and the public safe. But we want people to feel welcomed in this space. And that choice, I think, is really important when we think about public.
So, Dr. Kedrowski, Iowa State University Director of the CAP Center, your research explores the role of gender in the Capitol riot. Maybe you can talk with us about how the Capitol riot demonstrates the type of toxic masculinity that led to the violence, both against concepts of democracy and liberty, which have taken on gendered connotations, as well as the very real violence targeted against women, like Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kara, and thank you all for being here watching on YouTube. And I too just want to say, in terms of the thanks to Kara and others who pulled together today, ditto. It was a lot of behind the scenes work, and I really appreciate it. So I direct a Women in Politics Center at Iowa State University. So I am paid to think about things through a gendered lens. And it really struck me as I watched,
stayed at home as a good political scientist with my bowl of popcorn, democratic transition and watched in horror the events on the fact that the faces that we saw were overwhelmingly white male faces. And the images that are sort of now synonymous with those events, like Michael Chesney and his shirtless with wearing his horns and furs, and people in tactical gear and carrying the Confederate flag and so forth, just really struck me as sort of an exercise in hypermasculinity. So what is toxic masculinity? Michael Kimmel, who is a noted theorist of masculinity, describes the American myth of the self-made man, someone who is economically successful, who has economic security and emotional happiness from his submissive and adoring wife and children. So it really is the sort of 1950s myth that even if someone is working class and hasn't gone to college, that they can achieve material success and be the lords of their personal domain. Toxic masculinity occurs when this narrative collapses, as it has in so many corners of the country. Rather than blaming structural economic change, such as a globalizing economy, the development of a knowledge and service economy in the United States, and increased urbanization, these men who are overwhelmingly white and working class find themselves displaced from this self-made narrative. And they look for someone to blame. And so they believe that they tend to think that those that have displaced them from their positions of dominance, feminists, racial minorities, immigrants, the LGBTQ persons, are to blame for them losing their privileged position in society. So what do? They lash out, often in verbally and physically violent ways. Scholars have attributed toxic masculinity to a variety of social ills, including domestic violence, sexual assault, the involuntary celibate movement, mass shootings, and for our purposes, political extremism. I go on to argue that democracy in the United States has been gendered female for a couple of centuries. So before we had Uncle Sam as our sort of popular culture vision of the United States, we had Columbia, right? Who was at times European and at times indigenous to represent the North American continent, but she was always female. When you think about the Capitol itself, it is filled with metaphorical images of women, democracy, the Statue of Liberty, both in New York, but also Libertas, who's on the top of the Capitol building. Our common vision of justice, right? A blindfolded woman holding the scales of justice. They are gendered female. And even as we think about acts of patriotism, such as joining the military, what are we doing? We are protecting religious liberty. We are protecting freedom of speech. It's this notion that all of these things need protection. And that too is also a gendered concept. And then we look to Trump's personal narrative. And that personal narrative, be it true or not, is that he is the epitome of a self-made man. And what does his family look like? He has loyal and beautiful children who work for him in unquestioning loyalty, and a wife who is beautiful, who says little, if nothing at all, right? And so this leads people who embrace toxic masculinity to not only find that political extremism is very attractive as an ideology, but they also want to demonize people that run counter to their personal narrative. And that includes women who hold power, non-white males who embody power, and even white men that they seem cowardly and weak. So the very real death threats that were posited against Nancy Pelosi, as well as the attacks on her office, right? So there were two things going on. One is that the office was in a very prominent position, so it was easy to find physically in the Capitol, but they didn't walk by, right? They went inside. They broke mirrors, they stole a laptop. There's this iconic picture of the person from Arkansas with his feet on the desk. They left death threats and notes. The frightened staff members barricaded themselves into a conference room because they feared for their lives. But also Vice President Pence, right? You might think that the death threats against Pence run counter to this thesis. I would argue that it is actually highly consistent with this thesis. So in many respects, Vice President Pence is the demonstration of a healthy masculinity, right? He respects his wife and very clearly loves her, right? And he was very careful, as we've heard from my colleague, Mr. Kosar here, that he was very careful to think about what his constitutional duty was and to follow that as an act of conscience, but also as an act of patriotism. And how was he branded for this decision? He was branded as cowardly. Right, he was branded as weak, right? Will he stand up? Will he be strong enough? And these were words that his own running mate, President Trump, used to characterize him. So in terms of those who embrace toxic masculinity and political extremism, the fact that a woman holds the office of speaker, and the speaker's office is full of symbols of not only American democracy, but the very power of office that she holds is a real extension of how toxic masculinity can explain exactly why her office in particular was targeted and sustained pretty terrible damage. But we have seen rhetorically and over time blowback against other women who hold power in Congress, most notably the Squad, right? The four women of color, young women of color, who led by probably most prominently Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They are not only young and female and very outspoken about their values, but they are young women of color who wholeheartedly embrace their otherness. right? Their very dress, whether it's Ilhan Omar, who wears a headscarf, or Ilana Presley, who wore a wig with braids and now goes bald to embrace her alopecia. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who talks about wanting to demonstrate her Latina heritage by wearing the bright red lipstick and her hoop earrings. They embrace their otherness. They celebrate their otherness. And this is in particular very threatening to people, especially white males of a certain socioeconomic background who embrace toxic masculinity.
So Karen, I would love to follow up with you in terms of what specifically is the role of higher education in fostering the kind of civic education that will end discrimination, especially against otherness, and then ultimately violence.
I agree with everything that has been said about the power and the limits of increasing civic education. And I think that higher education needs to embrace the notions of teaching respect for otherness, and the respect and the advantages, frankly, that diversity brings. This is particularly challenging in the current environment where state legislature after state legislature has been restricting the kind of concepts that directly affect social studies educators at all levels about critical race theory, about even the teaching of slavery and some other very important concepts. But I think that we also need to move past higher education and think about K-12. Many of the people who are most disaffected and have been attracted by political extremism are those who do not hold college degrees, right? So how can we think about imbuing civics education beyond the classroom and in other ways, and have those lessons reinforced throughout our lives? And one thing that media scholars have noted is that people are increasingly found in media echo chambers, right? The people that we interact with on social media, the cable shows that we watch, our sources of news tend to be driven by people who agree with us. So our sources of knowledge is very homogenous, right? So for one thing, I think reinstating the fairness doctrine is a small and necessary step towards doing this, so that people understand that there are other legitimate perspectives besides their own. But it's also hard. And I want to say that living in a partisan echo chamber where we hang out with people that we like and who agree with us and poke fun at our adversaries through funny memes and jokes and things like that, that's kind of fun, right? It's kind of fun. That's why we do it, right? And it's much more fun than listening to somebody who challenges our very basic assumptions about who we are and what we believe, right? That's uncomfortable. And we are not good at living with cognitive dissonance, right? We're just not. So we have to teach ourselves that this is important, if difficult work to do, and that there is something to be learned by exposing ourselves to people who have different lives and different experiences than our own. And I hope that in this room, we have some great ideas about how we can make that happen. But, you know, it can't be something that stops at the 12th grade. It has to be something that becomes one of our norms of democracy.
Leah Serval. Of our team who are Sarah Akers and Angelina Clapp, also graduate assistant at JMU Civic. We've updated it through this week with revelations. We were busy all week ahead of today, creating this interactive timeline with primary source documents, original screenshots of tweets. That Leah really set the foundation and pulled together this amazing research project. So I want to ask you first, what is something surprising that you learned digging through all of the primary sources to pull this comprehensive? I think we've got 300 entries now, something like that, in this timeline, and we haven't even gotten everything from the select committee. So I'm sure it's going to explode once we get that. And then also, you know, as someone who is currently in undergraduate studies, what are ways that we can teach and learn through a public research project like this, that you and your team put together in order to advance education about democracy and civics?
Thank you for that question, Kara, and thank you to everybody that's here. The first thing that comes to my mind is definitely the vastness of the timeline. I think it covers about 4 years, at least right now. And, you know, inherently because it's got like 300 entries, there was so much that I didn't know. And I mean, clearly I'm involved with civic engagement in government and, you know, current events and things. And there were so many times where I was absolutely floored and shocked that there were things that I didn't know that were occurring, that didn't make my Twitter timeline or the New York Times articles that I was reading, and things like that. And most of that was things that contributed to the lead up to the event. So the posts threatening violence on online extremist groups and chat rooms, or there are two things that I wrote down that I wanted to highlight that I thought really interesting, that really stood out to me as two things that I wish I'd known. Is one, that the march was originally advertised as a sequel to a march, the Million MAGA March in November of 2020. And that aspect of the event has kind of been lost in the public discourse. And the Million MAGA March was led to, in the night of that march, there was violence between counter protesters and people participating in that march, leading to a hospitalization and a stabbing, assaults of many police officers, arson, and a lot of just general violence. And again, that was in November, and it was the first march that this was the sequel to. And I just found that really shocking. And the second thing I wrote down was that through my research, I found that on December 6th, during the Women for America First bus tour, there was a conflict between Trump supporters and counter protesters that led to a car with three young women in it, one of them being a 15-year-old girl, and a Trump supporter got out of his car, pulled a gun out of his waistband, and shot at them from 15 feet away, and like shooting one of them. She was hospitalized. You know, thankfully no fatalities, but it really shocked me that events such as that weren't viewed as, or weren't like seen to the public as like relevant enough or shocking enough, or it just really showed to me how normalized this type of violence was, and how normalized all this behavior was. And I mean, I think out of all the timelines I was looking at, because there were a ton of timelines by the New York Times, Washington Post, that event was only on one that I found out of the many timelines that I found. So even these like big, you know, respectable news organizations didn't include that event, or the fact that it was a sequel to this other violent march earlier. So yeah, I just think it really highlighted how normalized everything that led up to this event was, that it's just really shocking. And then to answer the second part of your question, I think one really important thing was that, like you said, it was a group project, and it was a really cool learning opportunity, because nonpartisanship to me at least, it feels like a method of thinking, and it feels like it's a practice. That's something that you need to learn to do, because, you know, we all inherently have our biases and our opinions, but to really, really focus on direct government documents and firsthand tweets and accounts, and just really, really highlighting nonpartisanship is, I think, something that was a really amazing learning opportunity. I'm very, very glad I worked on this project, and I think that's really, really important. And also, being a student and undergrad, it's important for students to learn how to do that, because again, public research projects are so important, because through my research, at least, I had timelines from the New York Times, the Washington Post, and certain law centers. There was a Trump Twitter archive that I used a lot as a source. But for all the timelines that I looked at, there were timelines that there was timelines of the actual day. There was timelines of texts and tweets. There were timelines of the government hearings, but leading up to the event. But and there were timelines of the online extremist groups, but there were none that put all those things together. There were no timelines that I could find that mentioned both all of the lawsuits that Trump was having, and also the online white supremacist groups, for example. And so public research projects like this and the emphasis on nonpartisanship are so important, because it's one of the best ways that we can put all these things together and put them all in context the best that we can, in ways that you can't otherwise.
All right, yeah, thanks. And we're running short on time, so I'll be brief. Actually, okay, I'll be brief. I have 3 basic points. Actually, before I say anything, let me just commend the timeline that we just heard about to folks. We have it pulled up here. It's fantastic, and especially in a context where the historical narrative for this and the basic facts of these events is being hotly contested, often in partisan terms. It's very useful to just have that happened before this happened. And because I think there is a lot of, amidst the sort of the various political agendas playing out and the debates as to what it means, that kind of thing, it's very easy to lose sight of just the basic factual narrative. And so I think that's super helpful, and sort of congratulate you on that. I'll be quick because the question Kara just asked, the short answer is I don't know, right? We don't know yet, right? So, and because a lot of this is playing out as we speak, right? So we are in an election year. It's the first national election since the events of January 6th, and it's playing out in real time at the state and local level in hundreds of, if not more, state and local races. So in Ohio, for instance, in the Senate race, we have multiple candidates sort of playing out basically a fight for the identity of the Republican Party in a lot of ways. And lots of things are happening at the local level. What we know at this point is largely anecdotal. So anything I'm about to say is subject to revision, essentially, but sort of just based on anecdotes, right? Or based on sort of what we can tell so far, what do we see happening out there? And I would argue there are 3 things that are maybe worth pointing out here. One is in lots and lots of campaigns, in congressional races and Senate races, at least, I think there could be a reasonable expectation that this would have been a major issue. If you're an incumbent running for re-election, for instance, the issue of what you did on January 6th or what you did in the days following January 6th would have been a major issue. I think you could reasonably predict, but we're seeing relatively little evidence of that. There are exceptions. Marjorie Taylor Greene's candidacy, for instance, in Georgia is, there are legal issues that have emerged in that race, but that's the exception rather than the rule, it appears. I can speak for what's happening in Ohio. We just had a debate a couple weeks ago with Republican candidates running for Senate, and this just did not come up. And I don't think that's an isolated anecdote, essentially. And that's an interesting thing to think about. It's not clear sort of why that's happening so much, but it has not become a dominant issue in a lot of campaigns. In the first real attempt, or the first opportunity as a nation to really kind of pause and reflect on this. Why is that? It's probably too early to tell, but one of the reasons, I guess this would be my second point, debates about this, to the extent that it's affecting American politics right now, have become highly partisan. This has become, so the meaning of January 6th, what it was about, did it actually rise to the level of an event that we ought to be talking about a year later even? That itself has become highly politicized, highly partisan. There was a period of time right after these events when it looked like there may be a bipartisan or nonpartisan consensus emerging about issues like the civic education. What does this mean about the health of our democracy to see fellow citizens, and a lot of us watched it, right, in real time, climbing the wall of the Capitol, that kind of thing. There was a window of opportunity there for a national conversation about that I think has been largely closed by partisan considerations, among other things. And I guess the third point I would make is just briefly is that I think there was a real opportunity there. I don't want to use the term opportunity. Oh, I just did. So, but a real moment where within the Republican Party, that the moment was present for a possible restructuring of the power structure within the party in a post-Trump era. And there were early indications that may play out, but again, we're not seeing that by and large. That President Trump's role at the essentially the top of the party is largely unchallenged, although we're seeing it in individual House races, for instance, some of that playing out. We happen to, the folks here from the 8th Congressional District in Ohio, we're witnessing that, where within the Republican primary in a heavily gerrymandered district, there is a Republican challenger to the incumbent who is running explicitly as the anti-Trump alternative in the Republican Party and is appealing to Democrats, actually, to cross party lines in the primary. That appears to be the exception rather than the rule. We don't know yet how that will play out. So I guess I would say, again, keeping it brief, that we still don't know ultimately, but we are seeing a lot of indications that this was not a political earthquake that I think a lot of folks expected. And in that sense, partisanship has reasserted itself, polarization has reasserted itself, and we are in some sense now engaged in debates about, and I mentioned this at the beginning, like, what do we even call this? Is it an insurrection? Is it an example of civic involvement that got especially active, or somewhere in between? And those, even the terminology is highly polarizing and polarized, and that fight's still going on. So I guess I'd leave it at that. But the big, I don't know. What do you think? Yeah.
Oh, when I was earlier asked about strengthening, I was asked earlier about strengthening, democratic moral institutions. I gave one answer, but it probably wasn't entirely satisfactory to individuals in this room or individuals out there watching. Like, what can I do? Maybe a question that's in your head. And I would suggest that one thing is that in each of us in our stead as voters might remember when we go to the ballot box a few basic things. Character matters. I think it's very easy to vote along partisan lines. I think it's very easy to get sucked into a view that politics is war. And it's a Manichaean struggle versus the white hats and the black hats. And I'm going to cast my vote for the white hat, no matter how big a jerk he or she may be. And that's a trap. And that's a trap. Because ultimately, when it comes down to those critical moments, when somebody has to make a decision, do I uphold the norm? Do I not abuse the process? Character is going to come to play. Political incentives are out there and pulling in all sorts of different directions. And character is going to be there. I'd also submit that interpersonal decency, when we look at political candidates, should be on our minds. As somebody who's grew up in Ohio, and I've been paying great attention to the race to replace Senator Portman, Rob Portman is a decent human being. You don't have to agree with various policies that he's pushed over the years, but he's fundamentally decent, and he's a guy who believes his job is to govern. A number of the candidates looking to replace him do not seem like decent human beings. They seem like people who enjoy further fomenting the feelings that we're in some sort of culture war, and everything's on the table. The future of the republic, has to be decided with this election. Voters, you kind of get what you pick. I agree that the partisan primaries and the other structures of the system can lead to results that pervert voters' intentions, but ultimately, 2020, 80 million people pulled the lever for a guy who had shown himself not to be of good character. And until we go back to thinking about public service as being something more than a war between two sides, and that character matters and interpersonal decency matters, and that politics and governing is fundamentally about compromise, negotiation, and getting things done, things are not going to get much better.
So we have an opportunity, we have a few minutes left before we have a little bit of a break. Are there any questions from those of you in the audience? And there are mics captured in the ceiling, so we'll be able to hear you on the live stream as well.
In regards to the implications of race of the events, of the insurrection, terrorist attack, peaceful protests, whatever you want to call it, how do you guys think that played a role? Because I know you talked about gender playing a major role in that, and toxic masculinity, but what about white supremacy in regards to that, and how a lot of people there viewed the protests for Black Lives Matter?
I think that's an excellent point. And if you remember, again, the images today, and when you look at who has been arrested and pled guilty and so forth, it's uniformly white, right? And many of the Anti-Defamation League actually has some really interesting pieces about the intersection of this political extremism with racism. And so the toxic masculinity, again, is very often embraced by white working class men who have been economically displaced by larger forces within the economy. And what they do is that they blame people they think have somehow replaced their hegemonic space, disrupted this success. And I think that symbolically, we also, very important that the police officers at the Capitol are a very diverse group, and they were physically attacked, right, on that day. So yeah, I mean, race is sort of underlying all of this, and including in this the Anti-Defamation League, especially at the intersection of sort of white supremacy groups and the political extremism. And we find that a lot of the people who have been involved in organizing those events are groups that are both, right? They are white supremacist and they are politically extremist. And so I think disentangling that is is probably impossible because they are two movements, extremist, and are showing a very, very disturbing part of American society. And while I have the floor, I just wanted to point out too that the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, is also out that among the people who have been arrested, about 13% of them are women. And most political extremist groups are overwhelmingly men, usually only about 5 or 6% female. And often, especially the white supremacist groups, like Proud Boys, I mean, think about that name, right? The Proud Boys, is that they see that the role of women, again, is very traditional, right? They're supposed to stay at home and so forth. What I argue is that, of course, women can be subject to toxic masculinity as well, right? That they can see that the narrative has fallen apart for the men in their lives, and in a sort of empathetic way participate in these kinds of movements, where again, they are also attacking anyone who is other. Thank you for your question.
I also just want to briefly add that there is a contribution to the eJournal article that addresses this issue called Promoting Critical Reasoning by our colleagues at Illinois State University, Kevin Meyer, Nathan Carpenter, and Stephen Hunt as well. So they weren't able to be in DC, but we did want to address this in the journal overall, and specifically also the role of higher education in addressing racism and its intersectionalities, and as it appeared both in January 6th, but also more broadly. I think we have time for one more question before we have a break.
One thing, suppose your name Randolph-Macon.
Oh, Rosenthal.
Hi. With regards to the bill, we talk about being able to have access to the Capitol, be involved in the democratic process and all that stuff. They have made it harder to get, but it's not impossible to engage with your members. Like when you go on your tours, it's literally just a historical perspective of what the Capitol is about. However, they still have opportunities to engage your member and contact them and meet with them. It happens quite a bit, but as you see with what they're doing with voting now, they're making it harder and harder. And when people meet resistance, they just say, forget it. So that's what you meet with voting, and what you're seeing with voting now, they're making it harder because we all know when turnout is high, elections usually go blue. But you see the decline because you said with security, you have to sacrifice a few things. So in the name of security, we'll cut off access a little bit, but you still can, so to make it harder to do. So it's there, but it's not easily accessible to.
And if I could just say too, I agree with that 100%. It also assumes a level of knowledge about how to make that possible that many people just simply don't have. And so even if they might be interested in acquiring, I mean, I even think now about, well-educated friends of mine who think they can just go to DC and they're going to go and walk into a member office and they'll have a chance to talk to the member of Congress. And I mean, and it hasn't been like that for, right? Like that's decades and decades in the past, right? But again, this sort of sense that I think many people have of kind of how things should work. And then they get there and it is hard, but not impossible. But many people just don't know how to navigate that. And for many reasons, some valid and some less so, we, the Capitol members themselves, have decided that they're not really interested in making it easier. And yeah, we could have a whole long conversation about that. But yeah, I think your point is really, really an important one that, and it really is now, we've historicized the Capitol, right? It's a historical site. It's not a working democratic space.
Up to mention, modest to mention work you've done. But in terms of seeing democracy in action, we don't have floor debates anymore in either chamber, with very rare exceptions. So the question becomes, all right, if I'm a citizen and I want to see this, where do I have to see it? Well, I guess you have to go and sit in on a hearing. Well, as your research, JD Rackey's research has shown, massive amounts of data on this sort of stuff. Quality of hearings. Becoming a little more
And
theatrical.
you're being equally modest because you're the co-author with JD and me, right? But hearings have far fewer witnesses. Everything is staged, right? So you're exact, and members are looking for sound bites to get media attention, not necessarily looking to really engage. So yeah,
They're not modeling negotiation, compromise, and modesty.
that's right. That's right.
For those that are on the live stream, we're going to briefly stop because we're going to take a break in the room for 15 minutes. And when we come back, we're going to be joined by Officer Harry Dunn, Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn, and also Officer Daniel Hodges.